Witnesses say at least one gunman opened fire on worshippers at the mosques as they were gathering for Friday prayers. Well, one man in his 20s has been charged with murder.
Police are investigating reports that an attacker live-streamed their actions. New Zealand's Prime Minister Jacinda Ardern has described the events as an extreme and unprecedented act of violence.
The 15th of March will now be forever a day etched in our collective memories. On a quiet Friday afternoon, a man stormed into a place of peaceful worship and took away the lives of 50 people. That quiet Friday afternoon has become our darkest of days. Mr. Speaker, we are a nation of 200 ethnicities, 160 languages. We open our doors to others and say welcome. And the only thing that must change after the events of Friday is that this same door must close on all of those who espouse hate and fear.
Prime Minister Justin Trudeau has issued a statement condemning the attacks. He writes, in part, "We extend our deepest condolences to the families and friends who lost loved ones in this senseless tragedy. Far too often, Muslims suffer unimaginable loss and pain in the places where they should feel safest. Canada remembers too well the sorrow we felt when a senseless attack on the Centre Culturel Islamique de Quebec in Sainte-Foy claimed the lives of many innocent people gathered in prayer. To move forward as a world, we need to recognize diversity as a source of strength and not a threat. Canada condemns this attack and will continue to work closely with New Zealand, our close partner and friend, and others to take action against violent extremism."
Hello everyone, Assalamu alaikum and peace be upon you. My name is Shaukat Ali Khan and I'm here today to remember and honor my good friend named Rashid and his 21-year-old son Talha, along with others who lost their lives in a terrorist attack on Nous Masjid in Christchurch, New Zealand in March 2019. I and Naeem were together in high school in a city called Abbottabad in Pakistan till 1985. The school where we went to is called Army Barnall College, Abbottabad, which was and is considered as one of the best schools. Like everybody else, me and Naeem stayed in touch on Facebook. And the day I heard about this incident, I sent him a quick message. Hey Naeem, hope all is well. Just saw the news on TV. Please respond, and never received any response back, which gave me a feeling that something is wrong. And later on, we saw all on the news what happened. If I remember Naeem, which melts my heart every time, along with all of other class fellows, Naeem from very early childhood in his life, in high school, was a very gentle, respectable and intelligent young man. He was looked upon as somebody who's upright, and he's looked upon somebody who's going to stand up for people if somebody's in trouble. And we always felt loved and cared for in his presence. This attitude of his also reflected at the age of 50 when he threw himself on the shooter, the gunman, so that the other worshippers in the mosque are not harmed, and accepted shahadat by giving his own life for the protection of others in the masjid at that time. Unfortunately, his 21-year-old son also got martyred, who was with him in the masjid at that time, along with other 31 people. And again, thank you all the organizers for arranging this Remembrance Day, and I hope by remembering Naeem, his good soul, his good nature, and his giving his life for the protection of others is going to be a milestone for peace for all the worshippers and Muslims and everybody else who are free to say their prayers and the way they want to spend their lives. And there would be eternal peace for all those people with the religious freedom. Thank you very much, everyone. Appreciate your time. God bless you all.
Assalamu alaikum wa rahmatullahi ta'ala wa barakatuh. I pray that you all are well and healthy and keeping safe. It is an honor and a pleasure to be amongst distinguished guest speakers and attendees. My name is Fuad Abbasi, and I am the Director of Civic Engagement with the Muslim Association of Canada. Let me first begin by introducing the organization that is the Muslim Association of Canada, which is a charitable organization and a grassroots social movement that provides spaces and services and programs for holistic education and personal development. MAC has a national reach in more than 13 cities across the country, with multiple numbers of massages, mosques, and education center and schools, full-time and part-time. We are here to commemorate the lost lives of our dear brothers and sisters in New Zealand on March 15th, 2019, in Christchurch, New Zealand. It is with a heavy heart and sorrowful soul that we remember the lives that were lost on that day, where a gunman and I choose to join the Prime Minister of New Zealand in not naming that individual out of respect for the people that died, because one of the things that he wanted to do is get notoriety for the work or the heinous crime that he has committed, killing 51 people across 2 mosques. And not only that, when he was asked later on in his court deposition, he indicated that he wanted to do more than that. He wished that actually he had burned those mosques even further and created more casualties. This is very saddening and really hits home with all of us around the globe when you see such hate that it's fueled by none other than ignorance for thy neighbor. In his sentence hearing, he was confronted by survivors and relatives of the victims in the court. And one of them had stated the following: "You gave yourself the authority to take the souls of 51 innocent lives. Their only crime in your eyes is being Muslims," said Maysuna Salama, whose son Ata Al-Ayan was killed. This attack, as I said, sent shockwaves across the globe, and hate groups have only grown in influence and in followership. March 15th is now another reminder for all of us of the threat of the white supremacy movement and the far-right groups in Western nations. It is only just 2 months ago, actually, that we commemorated the memorial for the January 29th shooting here in Quebec City in Canada. And now more than ever, we have multiple priorities at hand that we need to look after when it comes to the government action to combat racism and hate against Muslims. Governments must address the rise of white supremacy and other far-right movements and designate hate groups as terrorist groups. And we'd like to thank the Canadian government for working diligently at calling out these groups as terrorist groups. And we thank Prime Minister Justin Trudeau and his government for doing such a great job at calling them who they are. On behalf of MAC and the Muslim community, I want to thank the New Zealand Prime Minister and our Canadian government for their leadership and speaking against Islamophobia. We hope to honor those who have lost their lives, and we clearly state together across the globe that hatred has no place in the world, and we should not give hate groups any platforms to speak out of. Once again, thank you very much for giving me the opportunity to partake in this memorial, and I thank you very much. Wassalamu alaikum wa rahmatullahi ta'ala wa barakatuh.
2 years ago today, the world was shocked by the hate and violence that so suddenly erupted at the Al-Nur Mosque and the Linwood Islamic Center in Christchurch, New Zealand. Over 50 innocent lives were taken away by a man with nothing but hatred, intolerance, and fear of others inside him. It was an act of terrorism and of murder in a sacred place of worship, a truly heinous and cowardly act. One that caught the attention of the world, and solemn condolences and pledges of support came flooding in from every corner of the globe. People here in Canada, in every province, reached out to show their solidarity with the people of Christchurch and the Muslim community. On this second anniversary of those attacks, we take the time to remember those who were forever impacted by the events of March the 15th, 2019, and also reaffirm our commitment to oppose hatred, racism, and violence in all forms. Together with compassion and understanding, we can fight for a better world and work to build a better British Columbia, free of intolerance and discrimination for future generations. To our friends in the Muslim community, we stand with you. not just on this solemn anniversary, but each and every day. Salam alaikum.
Hello, everyone. Thank you for joining us today. Good afternoon, ladies and gentlemen. Assalamu alaikum. The peace and blessings upon you. I am honored and humbled to be speaking to you today from the unceded territories of the Musqueam, Squamish, and Tsleil-Waututh First Nations of BC. March 15th, 2021 marks the second anniversary of the Christchurch, New Zealand massacre, where a terrorist gunman motivated by hate and transnational white supremacist ideology consecutively attacked the Al-Noor Mosque and Linwood Islamic Center during Friday prayers, killing 51 people and wounding 40 others. The white supremacist variant of hate is spreading online and offline across the world, infecting people from Poland to Australia, from Canada to England, from Germany to the United States of America. Today, we will discuss this issue with a diverse set of experts and leaders from across the world. However, before we begin, as is traditional for Muslims, I would like to start this event by inviting Mufti Asim Rashid to recite and share the meaning of verses from the Holy Quran. Mufti Asim.
أعوذ بالله من الشيطان الرجيم بسم الله الرحمن الرحيم الحمد لله رب العالمين الرحمن الرحيم مالك يوم الدين إياك نعبد وإياك نستعين اهدنا الصراط المستقيم صراط الذين أنعمت عليهم غير المغضوب عليهم ولا الضالين بسم الله الرحمن الرحيم يا أيها الذين آمنوا اجتنبوا كثيرا من الظن إن بعض الظن إثم ولا تجسسوا ولا يغتب بعضكم بعضا أيحب أحدكم أن يأكل لحم أخيه ميتا فكرهتموه واتقوا الله إن الله تواب رحيم يا أيها الناس إنا خلقناكم من ذكر وأنثى وجعلناكم شعوبا وقبائل لتعارفوا إن أكرمكم عند الله أتقاكم إن الله عليم خبير صدق الله العظيم Assalamu alaikum wa rahmatullahi ta'ala wa barakatuh. I recited to you two passages from the Quran. The first passage was the opening passage, the opening of the Quran, also called Al-Fatiha. And in this passage, there is praise and glorification for God, the Lord of the universe, the Lord of the day of reckoning, the beneficent, the merciful. And there is a pledge to worship only Him and seek assistance only from Him. Then there is a prayer to guide us to the straight path, the path of those whom you have favored, and not the path of those who have drawn your anger, nor the path of those who were astray. This was the first passage. The second passage was a group of verses from Surah Al-Hujurat. And in this, the advices are, first of all, abstain from suspicion, because verily some suspicion itself is a sin. And do not spy on one another, and do not backbite one another. The example of backbiting is like consuming the flesh of your brother after he has died. This is something that everyone would abhor. Eating the flesh after death is being compared to backbiting, because when a person backbites, speaks behind someone's back, that person is not there to defend themselves. So this is just as disgusting an act as after someone has passed away, someone goes and tries to desecrate their dead body when they are unable to defend themselves. Then the verses go on to say that, O mankind, we have created you from male and female, and we have created you in societies, communities, tribes, and clans, so that you may get to know one another. Verily, the most honorable amongst all of you is simply the one who is most pious. Verily Allah, verily God is all-knowing and all-aware.
Thank you very much, Mufti Asam. I really appreciate those words. I'd like to start by acknowledging and thanking everyone on this call, including our speakers, as well as dignitaries from across the province. I see we have, let's see, Jean Swanson. Thank you very much for joining. So City Councillor for Vancouver, Jean Swanson. We have Kaylee Craig Domingo. Thank you very much for being here. My friend Mahreen Chowdhury, thank you for joining as well. Norman Franks, always a pleasure. Thank you. Brother Shaukat, thank you for joining. Shirley Bond, always a pleasure to see you as well. I want to, throughout the event, I'll thank more people as they join. If I miss anyone, please forgive me for that. I do apologize. Next, to start the event, really, I'd like to acknowledge MLA Ms. Janet Routledge, who for more than 30 years has served in the public sphere at the Public Service Alliance of Canada. She's helped workers solve problems, win better wages, and improve their own working conditions. Janet will now be sharing a few words with us on behalf of the Government of British Columbia. Thank you very much, Janet.
Thank you very much. I'm honored to join you. I too am speaking to you from the unceded traditional territory of the Coast Salish people, the Squamish, the Musqueam, and Tsleil-Waututh nations. And I'm very conscious of the fact that I am here as an uninvited guest on their land, and that they continue to make me feel welcome. I'm so honored to be here just to say a few words in remembrance of the people who lost their lives to a terrorist attack. I remember how I felt that day when I heard the news of what had happened in Christchurch on March 15th, 2019. I was horrified, I was angry, and I'll admit I felt ashamed. I felt ashamed as a white person that a terrorist thought that he could get away with such an awful act and in representing me and in my name. And in fact, that massacre motivated me to stand up and be counted. And to use every opportunity I could to distance myself from white terrorism, to speak up against white supremacy, to challenge racism, and to demonstrate solidarity with other races in word and deed. And in fact, one of the things during COVID that I've been very concerned about is the hatred against people of Asian descent. And I started wearing a mask early in COVID, even when people around me were questioning. Not because I was convinced at that point that it would protect me from COVID, but I did it out of solidarity because people who were wearing masks were being subjected to race hatred. So I did that in solidarity. I'm also want to say a few words about some of the things that our government has initiated to combat racism. I'm very proud of the fact that we now have, for the first time, a parliamentary secretary, Rachna Singh, whose whose job it is to review anti-racism laws in other jurisdictions, launch consultation with the public, and develop a new anti-racism act. And she's very committed to this and working very hard to reach out and engage. I'm also very proud of the fact that we reinstated the the British Columbian Human Rights Commission, and that this is a commission that is responsible to proactively seek out evidence of systemic racism, to make recommendations to government, to give feedback to government, whether we want it or not. It is her job, and it's the job of the commission to be ever present and on top of racism and race hatred proactively. I'm very proud of the fact that we initiated Resilience BC, which has put funds and resources into communities around the province to help identify white supremacy, to help people cope and respond to white supremacy, to defend themselves from racism, but also to be more than a bystander when they see racism happening, how to intervene safely for themselves, but also safely for who is being the subject of race hatred. Let me close by saying that, you know, my parents, both of my parents, fought fascism in the Second World War. My mother was the first person in her small Ontario farming community to join the Canadian Army. Not the first woman in her small community to join the Canadian Army, but the first person to join the Canadian Army to go fight against fascism in the Second World War. And my father was part of the liberating force that went across Europe, liberating occupied towns. And he, in turn, was one of the last people to come home after the Second World War, because he was part of the occupying force in Germany to reestablish and stabilize that country. So the reason I mention this is that my parents sacrificed their youth thinking that this kind of thing would never happen again. And what this has taught me is that we can't stop being vigilant. We cannot take it for granted, that we need to continue being aware of race hatred. We need to be, people like myself need to continue checking ourselves in terms of the assumptions we're making and the commitment we're making to others. So I commit to you that I want to continue working to make sure that nobody has to live in fear because of the color of their skin or because of their religion. Thank you.
Thank you so much, Janet. Those were very touching words, and it really gives a background to how long and how far this fight is against racism, racial discrimination, hatred, and the white supremacist ideology. Next, I'm going to introduce someone who has been fighting it as well, Mr. Kashif Ahmed from NCCM. So Kashif is the chair of the National Council of Canadian Muslims. NCCM is an independent, nonpartisan, and non-profit organization that protects Canadian human rights and civil liberties. They challenge discrimination and Islamophobia in particular. Kashif himself is a Vancouver-based lawyer and Juris Doctor, graduating from the University of Saskatchewan. He's also the first NCCM chair from Western Canada. Kashif Ahmed, please go ahead.
Thank you. Bismillah ar-Rahman ar-Rahim. In the name of God, the most compassionate, the most merciful. Thank you for that introduction. As mentioned, my name is Kashif Ahmed. I'm the board chair of the National Council of Canadian Muslims. Today, we really remember the victims of the Christchurch attacks and the devastation caused to so many families and communities. I remember that the night, it was the evening of March 14th, late evening of March 14th here in Canada, when we received word of the horrific attacks. And it was the most difficult feeling to experience as a Muslim in Canada, in the aftermath of what we saw in Quebec City on Jan 29th, 2017. It was like a movie playing again, but this time in another fellow Commonwealth country with its own Muslim community. And the attack, and of course the attack in Quebec City, have really shown us, and not just to the Muslim community, but to Canadians in general, I think, that there is real dangerous consequences to Islamophobia and racism. It's no more, a simple theoretical or abstract concept. This is something which is affecting the lives of Canadians, of New Zealanders, of others across many parts of the world. And so, the efforts that are being undertaken today and in the future are really necessary. At the National Council of Canadian Muslims, for several years, we have been working to bring awareness both at the public level and the policymaking level in Canada about this real and present danger posed by white supremacists and far-right extremism. Just this past fall, the NCCM launched a national action plan against white supremacy. And we had dozens of Canada's leading anti-racism and civil liberties advocacy organizations join our call, including many faith groups and faith-based advocacy groups, to call on the federal government to take concrete policy action to deal with the plethora of white supremacist groups. And we know from experts in Canada, including Dr. Barbara Perry, who is one of the foremost researchers on white supremacist groups in Canada, that these groups continue to organize, they continue to meet, they continue to plan. Just a few weeks ago in Edmonton, Alberta, we've had repeating Muslim women. I think there were 6 instances of that happening within a span of 4 to 6 weeks. And these kinds of incidents continue to happen, and they raise deep concern for our organization, which is why we're on a regular basis talking to government, talking to law enforcement, talking to our partner agencies to work together to deal with this issue. And our national action plan is really about having the government deal with white supremacist groups at multiple levels. The federal government has an obligation to ensure that the criminal code is used to deal with these groups. It has an obligation to ensure also that if there are gaps, which there are, in our security agencies in dealing with this threat, that those gaps are urgently addressed and properly resourced so that this major security threat to Canadians is dealt with appropriately. Even at the provincial level, and I'm well aware of the wonderful work that the BC government's been doing to bring attention on racism and hatred. And in Alberta, we've, just recently NCCM asked the government of Alberta and the opposition parties to join together and create a provincial municipal plan to deal with street harassment and street-based violence of visible minorities in the aftermath of these incidents targeting Muslim women. So there is a real multi-layered effort going on. And the NCCM is really proud to be working with some of the leading organizations, experts, and organizers on this issue, and to make sure that policymakers deal with white supremacy as a real threat, that we recognize the dangers posed by far-right extremism, and that the public also gets to better understand what this threat means for Canadians and for social cohesion in Canada. I think we can all agree that we all want to see a Canada that is safe, secure, and just for all communities, and that we can continue to all live and learn together in safety. So I'd like to thank once again this forum for bringing attention to these issues, and I look forward to the conversation today. Thank you.
Thank you very much, Kashif. And thank you for bringing up the issue of the terrorism facing our women in the streets. My wife is on this call. She wears the hijab. She's also a visible minority. And I'm personally terrified of anything happening to her. I know what hate is out there. I know what's going on. Even here in BC, Islam Unravelled, we launched the first self-defense program to help bring together Muslim women to train and protect themselves, to develop the mindset of protection in partnership with Yo Bro, Yo Girl Youth Initiative. And that shouldn't have to happen. Women shouldn't have to have the responsibility to defend themselves like that. So thank you for the work you're doing to help address that situation. Next, we have a woman who I am very proud to call a friend, Ms. Sonia Firstenau. She is the leader of the Green Party of British Columbia and represents the Cowichan Valley in the Legislative Assembly. Sonia, please, without any further ado.
Thank you so much, and I am really delighted and honored to be here this evening. I'm addressing you from the lands of the Lekwungen people, the territory of Esquimalt and Songhees Nation. And it is a true honor. I'm grateful to Islam Unravelled for your ongoing commitment to education, allyship, training, and for hosting important discussions like the one that's happening right now. I really believe that bringing people together is essential to help end the discrimination, racism, hate, and violence directed towards faith, racial, and ethnic communities. And I thank you for inviting me to this important memorial event during which we are commemorating the lives lost in New Zealand. We recognize so clearly the abhorrent expression of white supremacy and hatred in the acts of the gunman who murdered 51 people in their mosques in New Zealand. As Kashif points out, these are real, dangerous consequences of Islamophobia and white supremacy. We cannot stop taking these dangers seriously. And this evening, as we gather to commemorate the lives lost and also to have the discussion about how we can take action to ensure that these acts of hatred and indeed hatred itself can be removed from our society. We often focus on the actions of individuals who perpetuate racism, but we must also recognize the systemic racism that permeates our institutions and our society. What's hard to see and recognize as a white person, and what is absolutely our responsibility as white people, is the way that white supremacy and racism plays out in our systems and institutions and in the lives of people who are not white. We must relentlessly work to see this so that we can together build a society that does not systemically bestow privilege to white people while accepting racism towards Black people, Indigenous people, and people of color. It is necessary and essential that those of us with privilege work hard to recognize how that plays out in our lives, to understand the privilege of what it means to live without fear. That privilege, in this sense, has nothing to do with wealth or status or class. When I enter a room, my skin color is not an automatic barrier that I come up against. I don't fear for my children's lives, that they will be at risk if they are pulled over for a traffic violation. I don't fear that they are being treated differently by their teachers because of the color of their skin. I don't fear that I or they will be considered a threat to others because of the color of their skin. I don't fear the child welfare system. I don't fear seeking medical help for me or my children. And I don't fear that I may be attacked or murdered if I choose to go to a religious service. Living without fear means that I can focus my energies and my time on the things that I choose. Living without fear means that I have far fewer barricades and barriers in my life that I need to overcome just to do what I do on a daily basis. And let us reflect on what is lost because of the fear that people have to live with. How much potential is not being met? And let us remember, particularly this evening, as we commemorate the lives of so many people murdered in a hateful act, that the fear is justified is understandable, is a terrible and very real burden that Muslims live with. Let's start with agreeing that hate has no place in our families, our neighborhoods, our communities, or our society. And then let's imagine the world free of hate and discrimination. Imagine if we approach differences with interest and curiosity rather than judgment and fear. Imagine if our education system left behind its Eurocentric foundations and was instead shaped on the interconnectedness of all of us and all of our histories. Imagine if our communities created an abundance of opportunities for connection across races, religions, and cultural traditions. And imagine if our government institutions, our healthcare system, our judicial system, our child welfare system, our education system, imagine if they were all relentlessly working to identify and end bias, discrimination, racism, and hatred. And then let's stop imagining a world in which everyone gets to live without fear, and let's make that a reality. Leadership matters. This is what we can learn from New Zealand Prime Minister Jacinda Ardern. She responded as a compassionate, empathetic, grieving human to the terrible tragedy of the murder of 51 people who were in their place of worship. And she responded with concrete and appropriate actions. She banned assault weapons, she launched an inquiry into the shootings, and she and her government are implementing the recommendations. She acknowledged and apologized for the failings of her government. As we see from New Zealand, it is the responsibility of legislators and elected officials to take action. It is our responsibility to demonstrate leadership on anti-racism and to dismantle the systemic racism in our institutions, so the factors that lead to violent acts of white supremacy are addressed and prevented before more lives are lost to hatred. As Kashif so clearly explained just now, we need concrete policy and action to prevent the spread and threat of white supremacy. It really is up to legislators to recognize the monumental responsibility that we have, particularly in Canada, a country that is built on multiculturalism, that is built on diversity, that is built on respect for a variety of religious traditions, and a recognition of the Indigenous foundation of the lands that we live, work, and build community on. My friend Lisa Gunderson likes to point out, it is important that we take a personal look at where our power and privilege lies, so that we can be effective in taking action. I'm doing my best as a party leader to ensure that we are taking steps as a political party to look at our own systems and that we are applying an anti-racist lens to our work. We also reaffirm our commitment as an organization to building a truly diverse party, from our membership and volunteers to our staff, candidates, and MLAs. All levels of government need to work together to address systemic racism and ensure that funding is dedicated to the health and well-being of our communities, including anti-racism initiatives. And as my colleague Adam Olsen is fond of saying, racism cannot be addressed one silo at a time. Every government institution needs to identify how their processes and systems contribute to racial inequities, which is why we have proposed that the provincial government create an all-party parliamentary committee dedicated to addressing systemic racism. In consultation with communities, an all-party parliamentary committee can put together direct, actionable items to begin the process of dismantling systemic racism with a timeline to ensure that action is genuinely being taken. Thank you for inviting me to speak tonight. I greatly appreciate all of the hard work that went into creating and hosting this and so many other important events. And thank you to everyone at Islam Unravelled for making this happen. Tonight, I hold all of those who are grieving in my heart as we honor and mourn those who lost their lives in New Zealand. I hope the important discussions we have this evening will move us forward to becoming a more equitable and more inclusive society. Thank you.
Sonia, thank you for your words of allyship, understanding, and care. I especially appreciate the words that you said about standing up and against fear and building a world now, not just imagining it, but building that world now. You also mentioned the importance of good leadership, in addressing these issues. And this brings us to our next speaker. I'd like to welcome His Worship, Mr. Mike Hurley, the Mayor of Burnaby. Mayor Hurley was elected the Mayor of Burnaby in 2018. He's a recipient of the Queen's Golden Jubilee Medal in 2002 and also her Diamond Jubilee Medal in 2012. As the former president of the Professional Firefighters Burn Fund, he led the effort to raise $15 million for the Vancouver General Hospital and BC Children's Hospital. Burnaby is actually home to a large and growing Muslim community, and it hosts many of our most beautiful mosques. We are honored today to be hearing from Mayor Hurley. Mr. Mayor, please go ahead.
Thank you, and hello everyone. And my name is Mike Hurley, and I'm the Mayor of the City of Burnaby. And I want to thank the organizers, Islam Unravelled, for inviting me to take part in today's forum. It's hard to believe that it's been 2 years since the tragic events took place in Christchurch. And if I think back to when the word started to trickle in of the tragedy and how it made me feel and my family, I'm not a religious person, but at that time I got down on my knees and started to pray, because I thought, how can any human do this to another group while they're in their place of worship? And it was a really tough to put words to that, how it made me feel. But I come from Northern Ireland, and I grew up in and saw many tragedies in my time growing up. So hate, violence, racism, fear, they really are the what make the world sometimes a horrible place. And but I do have faith that we can all work together, and I truly enjoy going to our mosques, our beautiful mosques, and celebrating in peace with our great communities there. And I have faith that we can all work together, and that's part of the reason for this forum tonight, that we're going to be listening to each other and hearing what we can really do, and what we as leaders can really do, and as governments can really do to ensure that women can walk the streets and be safe, and that all people can walk the streets and be safe. And I am deeply committed to that. And I can assure the Muslim community that I stand in solidarity with you all to ensure that we get there in a very short order. And I commit that we will do everything we can to work with you to ensure these kinds of tragedies can never happen again. And that this horrible tragedy, this horrible event could happen in New Zealand, a country that is widely regarded as a place of peace and tolerance. That was really a wake-up call. It's clear that hateful rhetoric and extremist ideologies are no longer bound by geographic borders. And that forces communities like ours to ask ourselves, are we doing enough to combat hateful rhetoric and promote harmony and understanding? And how can we as a city engage anti-racist initiatives? And most importantly, how do we prevent race-based violence in our community? These are complicated questions, and I certainly don't have all the answers, but I am grateful for the opportunity to listen and learn from the experts who are with us today. Burnaby is one of the most diverse communities in Canada. More than 120 languages are spoken in our city, and more than half of our population was born outside of Canada. We often talk about how Burnaby's diversity is our strength, and it truly is. Ours is a city with people of a wide range of ages, abilities, gender, identities, sexual orientations, income levels, and heritage. Our diversity is what makes Burnaby such a vibrant place to live, work, and play. But unfortunately, it does not make us immune to racism. Complacency is not an option. And that's why I'm eager to hear from our panelists today And thank you again to Islam Unravelled for inviting me to take part. And again, I will say to our Muslim community, I stand in solidarity with you every day. Thank you.
Thank you, Mr. Mayor. I really appreciate your words. Burnaby is a lovely city, and many of our the most, as you said, beautiful mosques are there, Masjid as-Salam, which I'm sure you visited in the past. And just thinking about something as horrible as what happened in New Zealand happening there shakes the heart. These kind of hate events happened in Canada, in Quebec City. And it's something that, as you said, it's spreading around the world. And this is through online, through offline, which is one of the reasons why this forum is called the Transnational Forum, because the hate is spreading everywhere. Thank you very much for your words. Our next speaker is Mufti Asim Rashid. Mufti Asim started his journey from Edmonton, Alberta. He then began his formal Islamic academic studies at the Jamia al-Ulum al-Islamiyya in Ajax, Ontario. He further took lessons and graduated from the Islamic University of Benori with a master's in Islamic studies. Mufti Asim is the founder of Al-Ihsan Educational Foundation, which offers Islamic education in BC, as well as the founder of Islam Unravelled, which, as you know, is an anti-racist education and engagement organization. Mufti Asim, please.
Assalamu alaikum rahmatullahi ta'ala wa barakatuh. Welcome to all of you. Thank you so much, Brother Yusuf, for all your work in organizing this, putting it together, making contact with all our esteemed guests. And may Allah subhanahu wa ta'ala accept all the good work that you do. Honorable guests, esteemed dignitaries, it is indeed an honor and a pleasure to be able to join you on this occasion. The occasion itself is one of extreme grief and sorrow and heartbreak. I am speaking to you right now from Melbourne, Australia, and in my immediate radius are relatives and family members of those who lost their lives in the New Zealand massacre. And in fact, I have students here at the institution that I'm teaching who lost uncles or aunts. And we got to see the trauma that these families went through firsthand. And then that fateful trip to go and see their relatives after this incident. Suffice to say, it was a devastation at many levels, and it made us all question, question many different things. That what is really happening in the world, what direction is the world headed in, and what types of people will we entrust this world to after we leave? What will the next generations be like? What will their priorities be like? And what things do we need to think about as preventative measures to make sure that the world does not spin out of control? There is already so much damage and hurt taking place every day all around the world. So the incident sparked for myself and many community leaders, and I'm sure yourselves as well, many existential questions, the big questions, really what direction are we going in, and how can we somehow manage to control this before it truly it self-destructs. Racism it's not just an attitude. It's not just a social evil. It is a distorted perception. It is a certain lens through which a person perceives the world around them. It is a lens that on one side of the lens is a sense of superiority, and whatever is on the other side of the lens is perceived as inferior if it doesn't match certain criteria. And with this mindset, the person goes through the world perceiving things to be in a certain way, and judging things or valuing things or evaluating things with this sort of distorted and skewed lens that they have on. You know, it's interesting, and it's also disturbing right now in the context of what I've been hearing for the last couple of weeks. Brother Yusuf mentioned that I started out in Edmonton. Edmonton is my hometown. That's where I grew up. And I lived through some, I guess you can say, exposure, or maybe a great deal of exposure to what racism looks like, what it's like to be on the receiving end of racism. And it seemed like people have this pent up hatred inside them, and they channel it towards those that they don't like by virtue of their skin color or ethnicity or language. And I can say it's been more than once, many times, we were picked on by people in our neighborhood going to the mosque. That the lightest sort of thing was to be mocked and made fun of when you're going to prayer, because maybe the way you're dressed or the fact that you're going to the mosque itself. And then sometimes this would be followed up by the mosque itself being vandalized. People hurling curses and racial slurs your way wherever you are. It could be at school, it could be in the playground, it could be in the shopping center. You get the sense that you're not safe anywhere. And then there were those incidents where people physically attack you, they gang up on you, and they beat the living heck out of you just because they don't like your color. And ask someone who's been through that what their view on the world is. And as a youngster, growing up with repeated exposure to such attacks, to such physical violence and abuse, and then as a young teenager, many times I felt that these experiences can potentially lead me to a very dark place, a place where I hate the world. I don't like the people around me. I don't like the country that I live in. I'm not happy with anything because everyone seems to be against me. The system seems to be designed to sort of weed out people of different ethnicities and then attack them. And there was no one to stop them. I remember on one occasion, if it hadn't been for my science teacher who happened to be late at school, after track practice, a few boys ganged up on me and they just jumped on and I did not know them. They were much older than me, but they just kept on beating on me. And the science teacher just happened to come out through that exit of the school and managed to save me. Otherwise, I don't know, could have ended up in the hospital. So how many incidents will it take? How many people will it take going through these types of experiences before we really start taking a hold and a grip on the situation? Imagine my pain when I hear that in the last couple of months, so many attacks have been made on Muslim women wearing hijab right there in Edmonton. And I'm thinking, what has changed after all this time? We went through this as children, and now so many years later, decades later, people are still going through it. It's not only is it unfair, I think we should have evolved to the point where we all agree that this is unacceptable and there have to be certain measures that we take collectively. This is not something that, it's definitely not a political issue. We don't want to politicize it. This is one of those issues where everyone needs to get involved because the problem is real. We talk about, coming from the background of someone who has challenged radicalization, combated radicalization of Muslim youth, gone out there and challenged the extremist narrative, and done everything within our power and resources to deconstruct this narrative of Islam as a violent religion, or as a religion that is not at peace or can't be at peace with anyone. as someone who's gone out and done that, and then dealing with youth who have been, the recipients of abuse similar to what I've gone through, it's very difficult to give them a reason to stop hating the world. We're talking about people, we're talking about young, sensitive, delicate minds. And again, who are we entrusting the world to? Whether it doesn't really matter whether it's white supremacist or it's some other entity. The point is that racism is cancerous. It decays the inner workings and the inner networks, the beautiful relationships and ties that a society needs to have within itself in order to thrive and prosper. Racism eats away at all of those things. That's why from the Islamic perspective, the Prophet Muhammad ﷺ treated racism as a thing of the period of ignorance. Called it things from the period. He saw one man insulting another person by referencing their mother's race, that she was dark-skinned. The Prophet happened to pass by and hear this, and he said, wait a minute, did you just try to shame that man? He said, yes. And did you try to shame him through his mother, through the color of her skin? And so, he was obviously embarrassed and all of that. And the Prophet said, you still have some remnants of ignorance in you, of the period of ignorance. Even though you've come into Islam and you're now supposed to be enlightened, you've still got traces of that in you. He called it ignorance. When a group of people had a conflict and had a fight, and each one called out their tribe, the Prophet said, what is this? You're trying to pit tribe against tribe. What, your tribe is more superior than theirs and theirs is more superior than yours? It doesn't work like that. And in one of his final addresses in his farewell pilgrimage, he said, look, there is no superiority of an Arab over a non-Arab over an Arab, any color of skin over any other color of skin. And he demanded that all of these things be put to an end. So from our perspective, it's very clear what needs to be done. And the how is something that we need to work on together, because this is not something that one ethnic group can do all by themselves. Not even a couple of ethnic groups together can do this. We need the support of the broader communities. This comes back. When you hurt someone, then don't be shocked or surprised if they try to hurt you back. This is what we're seeing. We saw this in America at a very, very large scale. People felt the pain. They said, we're not going to take it anymore. And now we're going to retaliate. The problem is when you put retaliation into the hands of the public, then you have complete anarchy and chaos. That is not sustainable. It needs to be addressed at a much deeper level, at a grassroots level. So I'm happy that all of you are here. I hope you will really think about the how we're going to do this. Islam Unravelled, from our side, we are completely committed to this, to eradicating racism, not just in the form of Islamophobia and against Muslims, but any race against any race. We would like to see an end to that. We see that as harmful to our society and our future and our generations. Thank you so much again for participating. Our hearts and prayers are with the victims of this tragedy, and we hope that they have found the strength to move on and somehow calm some of that pain in their hearts. And we look forward to reaching out and doing everything that we can do to support them, to comfort them, and be of any service to any of them. Thank you very much. Assalamu alaikum wa rahmatullah.
Alaikum salam. Jazakallah, Mufti Asim. Thank you for your wise words. We are now going to be moving on to the panel section of our event. I would like to introduce our panel moderator, Ms. Amira Al-Ghawabi from the Canadian Anti-Hate Network. Amira is an award-winning journalist and human rights advocate. She spent 5 years promoting the civil liberties of Canadian Muslims as a human rights officer and later as a director of communications at the National Council of Canadian Muslims. She is currently involved with several initiatives to promote civic engagement in diverse communities, including as a founding member of the Canadian Anti-Hate Network, as well as the Silk Road Institute and an advisor to the Muslim Fellows in Toronto. Sister Amira, please go ahead.
Thank you so much, Yusuf, for that introduction. So good evening, everyone. It is really an important event that we're taking part in tonight. And I just wanted to thank everyone for taking the time to reflect and learn from the tragic events in Christchurch, New Zealand 2 years ago today. I'm pleased to be coming to you from Ottawa, from the unceded, never surrendered Anishinaabe Algonquin territory. Before we start with our incredible panel that we have set up for you tonight, I would like to take a moment as well to think about those whom we lost that day in Christchurch, New Zealand. And if I may share with you what I wrote the day of that tragic attack. I woke up to the news from New Zealand and my hands started shaking. My stomach began to ache. Within minutes, I was scrolling through my social media feed. Soon I was telling my partner he'd have to call local police authorities to request additional security at a community event planned for the weekend. My hands were still shaking. Would families attend Friday prayers today? Even if I had planned to go, I would now be too afraid. I worried for those who would attend, refusing to let such violent hatred stop them from practicing their faith. Then feelings of relief when I realized I wouldn't have to send my son to the local private Islamic school he attends. I just don't know how I will find the courage to send him on Monday. I didn't see the whole video. I inadvertently came upon a news story that included a segment of it. I couldn't turn away, even though people said not to look. The clip showed only the first few minutes of the video of a shooter pulling out his weapons from his car while music played in the background. The camera approaches a building, clearly a mosque, and the frame freezes, although the sound of rapid-fire bullets continue over the image. The newscaster tells the audience that while everyone in the newsroom has already watched the video numerous times, they will not be broadcasting it. It doesn't really matter because tens of thousands of people have already seen it, even as social media companies were working to remove the footage. My WhatsApp feed was full of hundreds of messages talking about the brutal scenes, showing a shooter killing 51 people at point-blank range. My friends wondered how they would prevent their children from seeing this, how they would explain the senseless slaughter. The terrorist who live-streamed his horrific acts had succeeded in sending a message to other like-minded individuals that Muslims deserve to die. He has succeeded in striking fear into the hearts of millions of people around the world, particularly those of us living as religious minorities in societies that may have become increasingly uneasy with our presence. It isn't as though sectarian violence is a new phenomenon in our world. There are killings between and within faith communities at almost any moment, somewhere. There is immense shock, though, when this happens in countries where there is a promise and expectation that people of all faiths and backgrounds will coexist in harmony. It shatters a collective sense of safety. It reminds us that there are those who are willing to use violence to hurt and divide us. Those who oppose inclusive multicultural communities are becoming more empowered in a world in which they can radicalize among like-minded co-conspirators and supporters online. They have become more vocal and more dangerous. New Zealand isn't alone in having to confront the ugly reality of white supremacist ideology. There are at least 100 far-right groups in Canada at last count. Hate crimes are on the rise in this country, particularly those targeting Muslim, Jewish, Black, Arab, or West Asian communities. We know that the Quebec City mosque shooter was influenced by a coterie of the who's who of the American far right. The New Zealand gunman had the Quebec City shooter's name etched on his weapons. When our federal government finally tried to address Islamophobia, racism, and religious discrimination in 2017, the effort was met with even more hate in the form of rallies and online threats. Some politicians even played along, suggesting that the whole exercise was simply a way to shut down freedom of expression. Subsequent government consultations to confront racism had to be held behind closed doors to avoid the backlash. If we are to learn anything from this latest attack on our cherished right to practice our faith freely and without fear, it is that we all have a duty to confront hatred unequivocally. We need to hold each other to a higher standard, and we must demand better from those with any power to fix what's breaking in our societies. No one should be this afraid. And with that, we'll dive into our panel tonight. Mr. Matt Ritchie is joining us. He is New Zealand Consul General to Canada. Tony McAleer is a former neo-Nazi and author of The Cure for Hate, a former white supremacist journey from violent extremism to radical compassion. And Dr. Heidi Beirich is co-founder and CEO at Global Project Against Hate and Extremism and former director of the Intelligence Project at the Southern Poverty Law Center. So we'll dive right in. Matt, my first question is to you. Earlier this month, on March 4th, the Islamic Women's Council of New Zealand put out a news release saying that there had been threats to use car bombs at the same two mosques that were attacked 2 years ago. And the council, in the news release, specifically thanked the police for taking quick action to respond to the threat. How alert are law enforcement agencies now to the threat of white supremacist groups in New Zealand?
Thank you, Amira, and hello, everyone. Before I answer the question or attempt to answer it, I just want to say a few words. So tihe mori ora, te whare e tune tēnā koe, te papa e wanhone tēnā koe, te ringarangama, maskuram, squamish, sabatu, thiwi, tēnā koutou, tēnā koutou, tēnā koutou, ko Matt Ritchie aho, haere mai, kat te kite, kia ora koutou. So that was just a quick hello, Māori hello, and acknowledgement of the people on this call, the land and the buildings that I am currently on. I'd also just like to acknowledge why we're here today. The 51 people that were massacred in New Zealand 2 years ago, the 40 wounded, and the countless friends, families, witnesses that were affected by this tragedy. So I'd just like to say that. To your question, obviously now compared to 2 years ago, the police and other agencies are much more aware. But you will have seen from the Royal Commission of Inquiry, a lot more needs to be done, which was recognised in that big body of work around making sure that the agencies, the government agencies, were covering all threats. Before the shootings, our intelligence agencies were very focused on visiting dignitaries, big sporting events and things like that. The Royal Commission of Inquiry has recommended that we really need to have another agency set up that looks at day-to-day counter-terrorism that covers all those bases.
Right. Well, it was very good to hear that obviously that law enforcement agencies in New Zealand had, obviously learned from this tragedy to take these issues more seriously. In fact, here in Canada, we had a similar experience as well after Quebec City, where we realized that CSIS had stopped even looking at white supremacist movements in this country before the attack on the Quebec City mosque. So it seems that there are sort of parallels in the fact that rather than the focus on the growth of white supremacist groups in both countries, there was a disproportionate sort of emphasis on looking at violent extremism within racialized communities and specifically in Muslim communities in these two countries. And so the parallels there are interesting. But I would say that even here in Canada, we know that law enforcement still has a ways to go. And I think that's what you're also saying, Matt. We just had, for instance, a fatal killing of a volunteer caretaker at a Toronto mosque this past fall, who was stabbed to death in what the police said was a random act. But within about 5, 10, maybe half an hour, we at the Canadian Anti-Hate Network were able to realize that the alleged killer actually had links to a neo-satanic, neo-Nazi group. So again, I think what we're hearing from not only communities in Canada, but also in New Zealand, that there certainly is more, as you said, Matt, that needs to be done. How important was that inquiry that you're referencing, Matt, though, in terms of providing sort of that guidance and information to the public as to what needed to happen next?
Yeah, so the report hasn't been released for that long. Like the government has obviously acknowledged and accepted all recommendations and apologized for all the failings that it uncovered. But so there was the establishment of a new counter-terrorism agency, but that's all well and good. There were some other recommendations that were probably even more important, and they were around making sure that the New Zealand policy around counter-terrorism is transparent, and different groups within New Zealand can actually take part in building that policy, as opposed to it just being in a closed door room in some government building, so that different groups, whether they're different races, religions, whatever, can actually have a say in what this counterterrorism agency should be looking for. And the fact that that's transparent means that I guess everything can be seen in the light of day, including media reporting on it and various other things.
Mm-hmm. So I'm going to shift over to Heidi. When we're talking about these white supremacist groups and the way that law enforcement is or isn't following up on them, what have you seen in the United States where you are, particularly when you were at the Southern Law Poverty Center and now the work that you're doing? Is society meeting the challenge that the moment requires when it comes to identifying these threats and having adequate tools to dismantle these groups and ensure that they no longer pose the threat that we're all feeling on, especially on a day like today?
Well, I'd also like to, before I answer, thank the organizers, Islam Unravelled, everyone who's here. These have been incredibly heartfelt comments that I share as I think about what happened 2 years ago, and actually many other white supremacist attacks that unfortunately have been happening worldwide in recent years. And Christchurch was so devastating. There are almost no words. As to your point, Amira, the pattern that you just laid out for Canada and that Matt laid out in terms of dealing with this threat for New Zealand is very much a similar thing that happened in the United States, especially after 9/11. We had a situation where our entire apparatus and law enforcement was focusing on a particular kind of threat, right? And it was in many ways led to some terrible disasters in terms of civil liberties for Muslim communities south of the border, south of your border. And the white supremacists had already been responsible for terrible attacks in the United States in the decade before that. Timothy McVeigh in Oklahoma City being a powerful and important example, which was the largest domestic terrorist attack in terms of the number of people killed in the United States at that time in the 1990s. So our entire federal government took its eye off the ball in terms of white supremacy. Law enforcement wasn't focusing on it. And, for many years when I was at the Southern Poverty Law Center, I spent time trying to lobby the federal government to take this threat seriously. And in fact, this went on all through the Bush years, all through the Obama years until 2014. And 2014 was when there was a particularly vicious anti-Semitic attack by a neo-Nazi on some Jewish institutions in Kansas. But in the months leading up to that, we had attacks on mosques, the Holocaust Memorial Museum, a Sikh temple. I mean, the pattern of white supremacists conducting these kinds of incidents had been growing and growing and growing. It was our reluctance to admit that terrorism basically can have a white face and come from your backyard and be part of your society, a result of the deeply ingrained white supremacy that's existed in the United States, that really caused us for a very long time to refuse to confront this issue. The rise of Donald Trump didn't help because he engaged in a lot of sort of courting of people with bigoted, racist, extremist beliefs. And I find that it's just now, and it's too little too late, especially after an attempted Capitol insurgency in January here, that the federal government and the Biden administration finally seems to realize that something needs to be done. So there's a big investigation being taken up here in the United States to figure out a path forward. And in some ways, there are debates over, what are the appropriate tools here? Does it make sense to have more domestic terrorism laws? We've seen those kinds of laws be used against marginalized communities in the past. The US has a terrible track record here. So we're really having a debate right now about how to move forward. But this was a threat that was far too long ignored.
Yeah, absolutely, Heidi. And I think that for those of us listening to you, we know that civil liberties were also eroded, extremely in the months, years after 9/11 as well. There's a long list of people, Meher Arar comes to immediate mind, but many others as well who saw their civil liberties suspended, in the rush to find blame, and of course the broader scapegoating of our communities that lasted for a very long time and is still with us, unfortunately. I'd like to bring in Tony in this. Tony, you yourself have been swept up in these far-right movements yourself. And I wonder, as we talk about the trends and the broader issues, if we can take a moment to try to understand, to begin with, what leads an individual to consume radical views to the extent that it would lead them to commit such an atrocity against innocent people simply gathering for worship on Friday?
Before I answer that question, I just want to preface it by saying there is no excuse or reasonable answer to that question. But the people that seem to be caught up and swept up in these movements, I'm a big believer the level to which we as human beings dehumanize other human beings is a mirror reflection of our own disconnection and our own internal dehumanization. And I think it's an outward manifestation of that. I think Mufti Assem talked about it, the dark place that people can go to when, bad stuff happens to them. And, we find bullies are often have been bullied themselves. And it's a pattern of behavior that, it's like hot potato. We want to get rid of it and project it onto somebody else. And I just want to be very clear here. I'm not making an excuse for the activities of those people. I'm not making an excuse for my own activities. Everything I did, I chose to do. But to try and understand the lens through which we make these choices, I made these choices, can help us get to a place of understanding whereby an effective response can be formulated. But often these people are feeling alienated. They join because they don't have a sense of purpose. And what these groups offer is a sense of community. I know myself, I got power when I felt powerless. I got attention when I felt invisible. And I got acceptance when I felt unlovable. And these vulnerabilities are exploited by these groups and by this ideology in order to be a false false solution to the inner turmoil that's going on, to make sense of it and to direct that angst and anger and rage to an external target, which feels pretty good. I mean, to go back to, Mufti Assem, when he talked about viewing things through the lens of supremacy, Well, I know when I was viewing the world through that lens of supremacy, it was to mask that I felt completely inadequate. And it was a lens of unsupremacy going on inside, and was projecting the believing that I was part of this great superior race made me feel better about the inadequacies that were going on inside. And so it's understanding how people with those vulnerabilities can be, the same vulnerabilities can lead to addiction. There's a whole spectrum of antisocial outcomes that can come from those particular vulnerabilities. But this movement is quite adept at exploiting them and sucking people in.
Thank you for that, Tony. And when I listen to you, and I wonder what recommendations then would you have in terms of how we confront these issues? How do we, I think, Heidi and Matt talked about, the political, the law enforcement, the security. Is that what's required? That type of solution? Stricter laws, designating the Proud Boys as a terrorist group? Is it about, ensuring that law enforcement goes after these individuals? What recommendations do you have, having been within these movements themselves, for society?
That's a great question. And I think as a society, it's important that we call this stuff out in a healthy way. But I think as a society, we must also be prepared to call people in at the same time. And I talk a lot about, we can't lose our sense of humanity. We can't lose our sense of compassion in our response to this evil. So I talk about compassion, but it has to be accompanied by healthy boundaries and consequences. And that's where the government policy, the law enforcement response, all of those things come in. But we have to call people out, but we must also, as a compassionate society, if that's what we want to be prepared to call people in. And there's ways that people can be healed and brought out of these movements. When I was with Life After Hate, I think we helped over 500 people get out. So there is the opportunity to rescue people from that world of dysfunction, but at the same time, the security and the safety and living in a fear-free world must be, the communities that have been targeted must be put first in consideration for that. I'm not saying that we need to worry about the perpetrators of this stuff first and foremost. But I think as a compassionate society, we mustn't forget about those people and bring them back, lead them back to humanity.
Mm-hmm. No, thank you, Tony. Going back to Matt then, and in New Zealand, I think the world really responded very much to Prime Minister Ardern's, the way that she responded with her own compassion to what happened, on that tragic day. Since then, can you describe how social cohesion, how inclusiveness, how that kind of compassion that Tony's talking about, how has that sort of been lived within New Zealand and within diverse communities there?
Yeah, so Prime Minister Ardern really led the way there. We all saw that. It was she filled a leadership void and brought out some characteristics that you've already described: the inclusiveness, honesty. That things needed to change. Manaki, which is it's kind of like, it's a Maori word for respect, but it's more than respect. It's about bringing out the prestige and powerfulness of the Muslim community and things like that. And so that leadership is actually, I guess, perforated into the society. And so there's people that have never set foot in a mosque before went and did that. They went to vigils. They've been to vigils. We couldn't do it a year ago because we were in level 1 lockdown because of the pandemic. But I'm hearing reports that yesterday in New Zealand, people were holding vigils again, which is kind of what you expect for New Zealand, to be honest. We're a very inclusive society, and yes, the first reactions were shock and disbelief. Personally, and everyone that I know and saw the news reports. But we want to be proved that we are that kind of society, and so I think we're stepping up even more now because of that.
Well, that's certainly, I mean, very hopeful to hear, Matt. Thank you for sharing that. Heidi, you had talked about the influence of so I love saying this, former President Donald Trump. And I know that even here in Canada, we saw hate increase by 600%. At least in one survey, in the year that he was running for president in 2015. And certainly we know the online space has not gotten much better than that. So, and you yourself have done a lot of work. In fact, you published a report linking Facebook's platform to global atrocities committed against Muslims specifically. So I wonder if you could share with us through your work, what role has Facebook had specifically when we talk about the spread of hate online?
Well, social media has been an unfortunate but incredible boon to white supremacy, really all forms of extremism, far-right populist movements. It just wasn't the case 15 years ago that you could connect hateful ideas with so many people so quickly across borders. And one of the biggest problems has been the fact that the large platforms, Facebook, Twitter, and so on, YouTube, have essentially been unregulated for a very, very long time. This has been changing slowly in the last couple of years, but I mean slowly. And these platforms, as a result of this and this view that, the First Amendment in the United States, which is very different than the way most democracies treat hate speech, but this idea that, you should be able to see whatever you want, whenever you want online, permeated these online spaces. And we have no idea how many millions of people have been radicalized into extremist ideas over the last, 7 or 8 or 9 years. I mean, it took Facebook, for example, to ban armed militias and QAnon conspiracy theorists until right before the election this year. These were movements that affected the American elections. So it's been a big problem. Facebook in particular actually created a loophole for Donald Trump in 2015 when he first posted about the Muslim ban, his planned Muslim ban. And they made a decision that they were no longer going to apply their own standards on hate speech, incitement, and other things to any politicians, nor would they fact check any of their advertising. As a result of that, it was like a loophole that you could drive a truck through, and it has led to some very virulent anti-Muslim leaders like India's Prime Minister Narendra Modi and his allies in India using Facebook to actually orchestrate riots and mass killings. Probably the worst example of anti-Muslim bias coming off of Facebook was the use by the military leaders in Myanmar. The UN said that the Rohingya genocide was orchestrated off Facebook. So we have a lot of problems in the online space in terms of what is allowed to stay up, how rules are applied, how this fuels white supremacist neo-Nazi groups, but also far-right extremist movements and populism. And frankly, it's been a bit of a disaster for the world. These platforms originally, claimed they were going to stitch the whole world together, but there are some arguments that could be made that it has, that they have torn the world apart in some serious ways. And I just want to say one thing about YouTube. The New Zealand Royal Commission talked about how YouTube was central to the radicalization of the Christchurch attacker. YouTube is a site that is nearly unregulated even today in terms of white supremacist and other extremist content, and even monetizes it. So if we don't do something about the situation with the social media companies, we are never going to get a handle on this kind of extremism and its proliferation. There's just no way. And I just want to say to Matt, my organization just recently joined the Christchurch Advisory Network, which are civil society groups that advise the New Zealand government on Jacinda Ardern's Christchurch call. I feel that there's a lot of hope in that movement, in the Christchurch call, to get a handle on these things. So I just want to applaud your government and the French government for having done that.
To follow up on that point, Heidi, here in Canada, we are actually anticipating legislation from the federal government around the regulation of online hate. We know that a vast majority of Canadians, according to the Canadian Race Relations Foundation survey earlier this year, are in support of regulation, stricter regulation, even across party lines. And so I wonder, some of the suggested approaches include the idea of takedown. So where you have to, you require these social media platforms to take down content, within 24 hours or face massive fines. And there's some debate as to whether or not this comes down too hard around freedom of speech, because the concern that has been raised is that if you require these platforms to move too quickly, that good speech will be taken down along with the bad speech. I wonder if you could speak to that tension between removing hate speech and the concerns that those who, of course, cherish freedom of expression have, that we don't want to, move too quickly and break things in the process.
Well, this is a line, right? There has to be a decision by all of us in democratic societies where that line between dangerous speech, right, hate speech that can motivate violence and so on, and free expression needs to sit. What you're describing is very close to what the German law is, which is it has a very short period of time, I think 24 hours for the major platforms only. And if the speech isn't taken down, there are serious fines that are involved. There is some evidence that if the tech companies feel so pressured by large fines to take down speech, they will end up taking down speech that's not hate speech. This is largely because they're sloppy and not very good at what they're doing, and they can't distinguish very well between, for example, somebody who's commenting on a racist position and a racist position itself. I mean, that's just one example. But I do think that if we don't, the whole world is moving to the position that some kind of regulation has to happen, even here in the United States, which is where you might think it'd be the last place that this conversation would happen. There are already bills being put forward to, alter Section 230, which provides this blanket exemption from liability for social media companies here in the United States, and actually around the world. It's inserted in a lot of international treaties, including with Canada and Mexico. But even here, they're talking about restrictions. I think the trick here is transparency and appeals. If you're going to go down this route, which I think most people think we need to, there has to be ways to fix failures, right, which are guaranteed to happen, to make sure that people can appeal quickly, get their material back up, and hone policies and procedures over time. But I just don't think the system that we have right now is working. I mean, there have been a ton of arrests lately of young boys, 13, 14, 15 years old, in multiple countries involved in neo-Nazi activities and planning terrorist attacks. That's just a really scary situation. It's children are being indoctrinated. We just can't have it.
No, absolutely true. And the idea of transparency is actually quite an important one, Heidi. Earlier this year, there was a report that came out called Harms Reduction, a 6-step program to protect democratic expression online. It was done by the Commission on Democratic Expression from the Public Policy Forum, an excellent report. I'll try to share a link in the Zoom call for those who are on Zoom, joining us in Zoom, but it can also be looked up for those who are watching on YouTube. And the idea in that report was that you would have an appeals process, exactly that was a recommendation in order to ensure that we try to maintain that balance that is so difficult. I'll turn over to Tony. When you're thinking about that online space, we hear a lot about Facebook. Heidi's talking about YouTube, but we know that there are other there are other channels as well, you know, that maybe we don't hear as much about, you know, websites like 4chan, 8chan, you know, less mainstream than, for example, the ones I mentioned, or say Reddit even. How critical is regulating those types of spaces? Is it even possible in terms of addressing, again, you know, the proliferation of this type of content?
I think it becomes more difficult, right? And the further sort of down the ecosystem of social media you go, the smaller the user base is compared to Facebook or YouTube or something like that. So yeah, I can't remember which platform it is, but you know, one of them, it's a Polish guy's side hustle. You know, the two guys have created code, and it's, you know, it's sort of taken off. So, you know, how do you apply those same pressures you would apply to Facebook, who can't do it with 50,000 people? How do you do it with these smaller platforms that simply don't have the resources? Reddit's not even a very big company, if you know, in the discussions that we had with them. So it becomes a challenge for these smaller platforms to dedicate and have the resources to handle it. And you get down to if the platform's small enough, it just isn't going to happen at all. The saving grace from that is these smaller platforms don't have the ability to infect a large number of people like Facebook can, but these ecosystems can still exist. And often they're going behind encrypted platforms for protection, so we can't even really see, or it's much more difficult to monitor what it is that they're doing. And you know, I look at this whole movement, so almost like an energy, right? And this movement always has, even before social media, it sucked people in and it spits people out. And even though the people inside it may change, there's always people being drawn into it, and always, you know, people being spat out of it. And so it's, how do you deal with that sort of, it's almost like an entity to itself. And, you know, the challenge really with the technology is, you know, when I was getting involved in the 80s and 90s, you know, you had to, you know, send away for a book or a videotape. You know, I just told you, you know, I just dated myself there, but you'd have to wait weeks or maybe a month for it to come, and then you go and, you know, right away for another couple of books. The process of radicalization took months, if not years. Now you can binge watch an ideology in a weekend, and the time frame that which people can be radicalized, the time frame from which you can have access to and consume enormous amounts of misinformation is really shrunk. And you know, if you think of the killer that murdered 9 people in Charleston, and Emmanuel American Church, I think it was. I won't say his name. I don't think we should. But you know, he just started off with a simple Google search, black on white crime. And the other aspect to understand about these social media platforms is the role that the algorithms play, right? You know, these algorithms are designed, they're kind of agnostic. They're designed to give us more of what we're looking for. And it doesn't really care what that is. And it doesn't take long before you search for one thing, and it's now, here's, you know, 5 other choices, and we can go deep down the rabbit hole and radicalize very quickly.
Right. And so when we're thinking about, you know, what we've been talking about just throughout this evening in terms of the dehumanization of certain communities, and thinking about specifically then Muslim communities, I remember reading a book by Doug Saunders, Globe and Mail journalist, The Myth of the Muslim Tide, where he talks about the way that there are, throughout history, we have seen the demonization of various communities, and continue to, whether it's Indigenous communities, whether it's Black communities, in the past, Irish, Italian, you know, there's many Japanese, Canadians, the list sadly goes on. But what I think is interesting when it comes to hate against Muslims is there's actually an Islamophobia industry that is pumping out content that is specifically divisive, specifically promoting lies and misinformation. Tony, I wonder if you could talk a little bit about why in particular this kind of content seems to sadly have so much resonance amongst white supremacist groups.
I think it taps into deeper aspects of connection that can feel threatened. I think there's a certain amount of it that appeals to Christians, and feeling the threat that gets made up about Islam, and Christianity. So I think it can be manipulated to apply to sort of a wider group that believes it at different levels, and I think that's what really makes it quite dangerous in the tropes that they tell. And there is a history of conflict between Christianity and Islam, going back over 1,000 years, that can be exploited and is exploited, and bringing up the Crusades and all of this European history, which has a long history with Islam. But those imagery of conflict and war and all of those things that are a normalized part of Eurocentric history can be brought to bear. It's easy for people to identify with it through that lens than it is to identify it through the lens of sort of a neo-Nazi supremacist view over Islam. And I think that's part of how it gets normalized.
So a lot to kind of try to grapple with, and the time has just been going by so quickly. I think, if we just have final thoughts from both Matt and Tony. Dr. Heidi had to pop off the call. She's on the East Coast, but if I can just get sort of concluding remarks from both of you around, again, just the significance of this day and sort of looking forward.
Thanks, Amara. So I guess in conclusion, my thoughts are that yes, there is work that governments and the political world can do, but at the end of the day, it comes down to the people. Like, it's myself, how I bring up my children, and all that I can do to help society do the same good things in an inclusive society. There's actually a great Maori proverb that kind of summarizes that. It's "He ata te mā, nui u te ao." It just means what's the most important thing in the world? And the answer is he tangata, he tangata, he tangata, the people, the people, the people. And I'll leave it there.
Thank you. Tony?
I think it's absolutely important that we remember the events that have happened, but at the same time maintain a sense of hope. As horrific as that atrocity was, I'm hopeful. I believe in people, and I believe in the common humanity that will prevail. And we must never forget what happened, but we must carry it forward into our living. And I think as human beings, we have this tremendous ability to inspire people, for better or for worse. And it's who we choose to be in every moment of every day. It's who we choose to be when we observe someone being harassed on the bus or at the bus stop. And I think we can teach the people around us to operate from these higher governing principles of compassion, humanity, and courage, to respond to this stuff. And as human beings, we operate from one or two places. That is love or fear, and we get to choose which.
Well, on that beautiful note, thank you so much, Matt Ritchie. Thank you so much, Tony McAleer. I encourage people to read your book, and I will pass it back to Yusuf to conclude our program for this evening.
Thank you so much, Amira. Everyone, I know we went a bit over our time, but it is such an important and broad topic to be discussed. I want to end by giving my sincere thanks and appreciation for our speakers today, including Brother Kashif Ahmed, Janet Rutledge, thank you for speaking, Mufti Asim Rashid, Sonia Fursanel, thank you, Mayor Mike Hurley, appreciate you joining us today. Amira, thank you for the job that you've done in hosting the panel, it's appreciated. Tony McAleer, thank you, Matt Ritchie, and if you watch it again, Dr. Heidi Bayrich, thank you very much for everything. Have a wonderful night, everyone. Take care.